Harrison Mitchell stood on the balcony of his penthouse office in downtown Chicago, surveying the city skyline that had been the backdrop to his meteoric rise in corporate America. At 52, he was the CEO of Mitchell & Associates, one of the most successful investment firms in the Midwest, managing over $3 billion in assets for wealthy clients across the nation. Harrison had built his empire through a combination of shrewd business acumen, strategic networking, and an unwavering focus on profit that had sometimes required difficult decisions about personnel and partnerships. His corner office, decorated with awards and photographs with political leaders, testified to his influence in both business and social circles throughout Illinois. The success had afforded Harrison and his family a lifestyle of extraordinary privilege. Their mansion in Winnetka, one of Chicago's most exclusive suburbs, sat on 3 acres of manicured grounds with lake views that had cost him $12 million. His wife, Catherine, dedicated her time to charity galas and country club committees, while their 16-year-old daughter Emma attended Northfield Academy, the most prestigious private school in the area. Emma was Harrison's pride and joy, a brilliant student who excelled in academics, played varsity tennis, and had already received early interest from Ivy League universities. She possessed her father's intelligence and her mother's social grace, moving effortlessly through the rarefied world of Chicago's elite families. Harrison had carefully cultivated relationships that would ensure Emma's continued success in whatever career path she chose. This carefully constructed world of privilege and success had insulated the Mitchell family from many of the social complexities that affected less fortunate Americans. Harrison's business associates, social circle, and country club membership reflected a homogeneous environment where diversity was limited and comfort came from familiarity with others who shared similar backgrounds and economic status. The foundation of Harrison's worldview was about to be challenged in ways he could never have anticipated, forcing him to confront assumptions and prejudices he had never been required to examine in his insulated world of corporate success and suburban privilege. Chapter 2. Emma's Announcement. Emma Mitchell burst through the front door of the family mansion with her characteristic enthusiasm, calling out to her parents that she had brought a friend home from school. This was not unusual. Emma frequently invited classmates to their house for study sessions or social gatherings, and Catherine always welcomed these visits as opportunities to strengthen Emma's relationships within their social circle. Harrison was in his home office, reviewing quarterly reports for a major client presentation the following week, when he heard unfamiliar voices coming from the main living room. Emma's laughter mixed with deeper tones that suggested she had brought home one of her male classmates, something that had become more common as she entered her junior year at Northfield Academy. Catherine called up to Harrison from the foyer, informing him that Emma had brought home a study partner for their upcoming advanced placement history project. The project required students to interview community members about significant historical events, and Emma had apparently found someone particularly knowledgeable to help with her research on civil rights movements in Chicago during the 1960s. Harrison made his way downstairs, expecting to meet another student from Emma's usual circle of friends, children of lawyers, doctors, and business executives who comprised the majority of Northfield Academy's student body. These were young people he knew by reputation through their families, connections that reinforced the social networks that had been crucial to his own business success. As Harrison entered the living room, he stopped short at the sight of Emma sitting at the piano with a young African-American boy who appeared to be about her age. The boy was well dressed in what looked like a Northfield Academy uniform, and he was helping Emma organize research materials spread across the coffee table. Their interaction was comfortable and familiar, suggesting a friendship that had been developing over time. Emma looked up at her father with bright eyes, clearly excited to introduce her study partner and share details about their fascinating research project on Chicago's civil rights history. Chapter 3. The Introduction. Emma jumped up from the piano bench with evident enthusiasm, eager to introduce her study partner to her father. She had spoken frequently about her new friend Marcus during family dinners, describing his intelligence, his knowledge of history, and his talent for research, but this was the first time she had brought him to the house. Marcus stood politely as Harrison entered the room, extending his hand with the confident bearing of someone well-versed in social etiquette. He was tall for his age, with an athletic build that suggested involvement in sports, and his manner of dress and speech immediately indicated that he came from a well-educated background, despite Harrison's initial assumptions about his presence in their home. Emma beamed as she made the introduction, clearly proud of her friendship with Marcus and excited about their collaborative work on the history project. She explained that Marcus had access to primary source documents and personal interviews that would make their project exceptional, and she praised his analytical skills and writing ability with genuine admiration. Harrison shook Marcus's hand automatically, going through the motions of polite hospitality while his mind processed the unexpected situation. His discomfort was subtle but present, not overt racism, but the unease of someone whose social world rarely included black individuals as equals or guests in his home. Marcus responded to the introduction with impressive poise, thanking Mr. Mitchell for allowing him to work at their house and complimenting the beautiful piano that had caught his attention. He mentioned that he also played piano and had been admiring the quality of the instrument while waiting for Emma to gather her research materials. The conversation remained surface level and cordial, but Harrison found himself evaluating Marcus through lenses he rarely acknowledged, wondering about the boy's family background, how he had gained admission to Northfield Academy, and what his presence in their social circle might mean for Emma's reputation within their community. Chapter 4. The Research Project. As Emma and Marcus spread their research materials across the dining room table, Harrison observed their collaboration with growing curiosity about the depth of their friendship and the scope of their academic work. Their project focused on the Chicago Freedom Movement of 1966, when Martin Luther King Jr. had brought his civil rights campaign to the North, challenging segregation in housing and employment. Marcus demonstrated an impressive command of the historical material, referencing specific events, dates, and key figures with an accuracy that suggested extensive prior knowledge beyond what might be expected from typical high school research. He spoke about the movement with passion and detail, citing primary sources and personal accounts that brought the history to life. Emma listened to Marcus with rapt attention, taking notes and asking thoughtful questions that showed her own engagement with the material. Their intellectual partnership was evident. Each contributed different strengths to the project, with Marcus providing historical depth and Emma offering analytical frameworks and organizational skills. Harrison found himself unexpectedly impressed by Marcus's knowledge and presentation skills. The boy articulated complex historical concepts clearly, drew connections between past and present social issues, and demonstrated critical thinking abilities that would have been impressive in college students, let alone high school juniors. The research materials included photocopied documents, newspaper clippings, and transcripts of interviews with civil rights veterans who had participated in the Chicago campaign. Marcus explained that he had gained access to these materials through family connections and community relationships that had given him unique insights into this historical period. As Harrison listened to the discussion, he began to realize that Marcus's understanding of civil rights history was not merely academic, but seemed rooted in personal or family experience. The boy spoke about discrimination in housing, employment, and education with an immediacy that suggested these were not abstract historical concepts, but issues that had affected people he knew personally. Chapter 5. Uncomfortable Realizations. Harrison excused himself from the dining room, but lingered in the adjacent hallway, continuing to overhear Emma and Marcus's conversation about their research project. What he heard challenged many of his assumptions about Chicago's social and economic history, particularly regarding practices in real estate and employment that had contributed to racial segregation in the city. Marcus was explaining to Emma how discriminatory lending practices and racial covenants had shaped Chicago's neighborhood demographics, creating patterns of segregation that persisted long after civil rights legislation had made such practices officially illegal. He described specific examples of how certain companies and institutions had participated in these discriminatory systems. Harrison felt increasingly uncomfortable as Marcus referenced business practices and institutional policies that had contributed to racial inequality in Chicago. Some of the companies and organizations mentioned were ones with which Harrison's firm had business relationships, and a few were clients whose accounts had contributed significantly to his company's success over the years. Emma asked probing questions about how such discrimination had affected families economically and socially, wondering aloud how long it might take for the effects of such policies to be overcome. Marcus responded with examples of how discriminatory practices had limited generational wealth accumulation in Black communities, creating lasting economic disadvantages. The conversation touched on topics that Harrison had never seriously considered from the perspective Marcus was presenting. In his business world, success was typically attributed to individual merit and hard work, with little analysis of systemic factors that might create unequal opportunities for different groups. Harrison began to feel defensive about his own success, wondering if Marcus's historical analysis might somehow be directed toward people like him, wealthy white business leaders who had benefited from economic systems that the boy was describing as discriminatory. The discomfort was new and unsettling for someone accustomed to confidence in his achievements and social position. Chapter 6. The Family Background. During a break in their research session, Emma asked Marcus about his family background and how he had become so knowledgeable about Chicago's civil rights history. Marcus's response revealed personal connections to the historical events they were studying that Harrison found both surprising and unsettling. Marcus explained that his grandfather had been a prominent figure in the Chicago freedom movement, working alongside Martin Luther King Jr. During the 1966 campaign for open housing. His grandmother had been a school teacher who participated in efforts to integrate Chicago's public schools during the 1960s and 1970s. The family's involvement in civil rights activism had continued through the generations. Marcus's father was a successful attorney specializing in civil rights law and employment discrimination cases, while his mother worked as a physician at a community health center serving underserved neighborhoods on Chicago's South Side. Emma was fascinated by these family connections to history, asking detailed questions about Marcus's grandparents' experiences and their perspectives on how much progress had been made since the 1960s. Marcus shared stories with a maturity and thoughtfulness that impressed Harrison, despite his growing discomfort with the conversation's direction. Marcus mentioned that his family lived in Hyde Park, a neighborhood known for its intellectual character and diversity, home to the University of Chicago, and a community that had attracted academics, professionals, and activists for decades. His description of his family's social circle included professors, lawyers, doctors, and other professionals who were engaged in various forms of social justice work. Harrison realized that Marcus came from a background of privilege and education that paralleled his own family's status, but with a completely different perspective on social issues and historical responsibility. This challenged Harrison's unconscious assumptions about race and class, forcing him to confront stereotypes he hadn't realized he held. Chapter 7. The Name Revelation. As the afternoon progressed and Marcus prepared to leave, Emma walked him to the front door while Harrison remained in his office, ostensibly working but actually processing his conflicted feelings about his daughter's new friendship. The intellectual caliber of Marcus's conversation had impressed him, but the boy's perspectives on social justice issues had created an undercurrent of tension that Harrison couldn't quite articulate. Catherine appeared in Harrison's office doorway, mentioning that she had overheard some of Emma and Marcus's conversation and found it quite impressive how knowledgeable the young man was about Chicago history. She noted that Marcus seemed to come from a very well-educated family and suggested that Harrison might want to meet the boy's parents at some point. Emma returned to the house excited about the progress she and Marcus had made on their project, chattering enthusiastically about the insights he had shared and the quality of research materials he had access to through his family connections. She mentioned that Marcus had invited her to interview his grandfather for their project, describing him as a fascinating historical figure. When Harrison asked casually about Marcus's full name for his own reference, Emma replied without thinking much about it. She said his name was Marcus Washington, the same Washington family that Harrison had heard referenced in Chicago civil rights circles, though he had never made personal connections with them. The name hit Harrison like a physical blow. Robert Washington was not just any civil rights attorney. He was the lawyer who had filed a major discrimination lawsuit against Harrison's company 3 years earlier. The case had been settled out of court for a substantial sum, with confidentiality agreements that prevented discussion of the details, but it had been one of the most stressful and expensive legal challenges Harrison's firm had ever faced. Harrison's mind raced as he realized that Marcus was the son of the man who had cost his company millions of dollars and had questioned the fundamental practices that had built Harrison's success in the financial services industry. Chapter 8. The Haunting Past. The Washington lawsuit had been a watershed moment in Harrison's career, though he had successfully kept the details from becoming public knowledge through expensive legal maneuvering and confidential settlements. Robert Washington had represented a group of black professionals who alleged that Harrison's firm had systematically excluded them from investment opportunities and financial services that were routinely offered to white clients with similar or lesser qualifications. The case had exposed practices within Harrison's firm that, while not explicitly racial in their language, had resulted in dramatic disparities in how clients were treated based on their backgrounds and social connections. Washington had presented evidence of communication patterns, referral systems, and client development strategies that effectively created barriers for minority clients seeking wealth management services. Harrison had been forced to confront evidence that his firm's client base was overwhelmingly white and affluent, not merely because of market dynamics, but because of systematic practices that discouraged diversity. The lawsuit had alleged that these practices violated fair lending laws and constituted a pattern of discrimination that had persisted for years. The financial settlement had been substantial, over $8 million, but the real cost had been the forced examination of business practices that Harrison had never questioned. The legal process had required him to review years of client communications, hiring decisions, and partnership considerations that revealed patterns he had been unconscious of or had chosen to ignore. Robert Washington had been relentless in his pursuit of the case, demonstrating a legal acumen and moral conviction that had ultimately forced Harrison to settle rather than risk a public trial that could have destroyed his company's reputation. Washington's presentation of the evidence had been so compelling that Harrison's own attorneys had recommended settlement despite the enormous cost. Now, 3 years later, Harrison realized that he was hosting the son of the man who had fundamentally challenged the foundation of his business success and had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic inequality in American finance. Chapter 9. The Internal Conflict. Harrison spent the evening after Marcus's visit in a state of internal turmoil, wrestling with conflicting emotions about his daughter's friendship and its implications for his family's future. His protective instincts as a father warred with his business-minded concerns about potential complications arising from Emma's relationship with Robert Washington's son. The irony of the situation was not lost on Harrison. Emma's academic interest in civil rights history had led her to form a friendship with the son of the very man who had challenged Harrison's company on civil rights grounds. The research project that had brought them together focused on exactly the kinds of systemic discrimination that Robert Washington had alleged in his lawsuit against Harrison's firm. Harrison found himself evaluating Marcus through the lens of his legal conflict with the boy's father, wondering if Marcus was aware of the lawsuit and whether his friendship with Emma might be motivated by anything beyond genuine academic and social connection. These suspicions troubled Harrison because they forced him to acknowledge his own prejudices and defensive reactions. At the same time, Harrison couldn't deny that Marcus had impressed him with his intelligence, knowledge, and social skills. The boy clearly came from a family that valued education and achievement, and his presence at Northfield Academy indicated academic excellence that had earned him admission to one of the most competitive schools in the region. Catherine noticed Harrison's distracted mood during dinner and asked if something was troubling him about Emma's new friend. Harrison deflected her questions, uncertain how to explain his complex reactions without revealing details about the lawsuit that he had kept confidential even from his family. Emma, meanwhile, continued to praise Marcus's contributions to their project and mentioned that she was looking forward to meeting his grandfather for their interview. Her enthusiasm for the friendship and admiration for Marcus's family history created additional pressure for Harrison, who felt trapped between his daughter's happiness and his own unresolved feelings about the Washington family. Chapter 10. The Sleepless Night. Harrison lay awake that night, his mind churning through memories of the lawsuit and trying to reconcile his business experiences with the reality of Marcus's presence in his daughter's life. The legal battle with Robert Washington had been the most challenging professional crisis of his career, forcing him to examine practices and assumptions that had previously gone unquestioned. The lawsuit had revealed to Harrison that his understanding of his own business practices had been incomplete or willfully blind. Evidence presented by Washington had shown disparities in client treatment that Harrison had attributed to natural market forces or individual choices, but which actually reflected systematic patterns that disadvantaged black clients and professionals. Harrison remembered the deposition process during which Washington had questioned him about hiring practices, client referral systems, and social networking approaches that had built his business success. Many of these practices had seemed natural and appropriate to Harrison, leveraging existing relationships, working within established networks, and maintaining the cultural fit that ensured client comfort. Washington had methodically demonstrated how these seemingly innocent practices created insurmountable barriers for qualified black professionals seeking to access the same services and opportunities offered to white clients. The attorney had presented statistical evidence, communication records, and testimony that painted a picture of systemic exclusion that Harrison had been unconscious of or had rationalized as business necessity. The most difficult aspect of the lawsuit had been confronting evidence that challenged Harrison's self-perception as a fair and merit-based businessman. He had built his career believing that success rewarded hard work and talent, but Washington had shown how systemic advantages and networking opportunities had facilitated his rise in ways that were unavailable to equally qualified individuals from different backgrounds. Now, as Harrison considered Marcus's presence in Emma's life, he wondered if this was some form of cosmic justice or coincidence that was forcing him to confront the human consequences of the business practices that had enriched him but had potentially limited opportunities for families like the Washingtons. Chapter 11. The Decision to Investigate. The following morning, Harrison found himself unable to concentrate on his usual business activities. His curiosity about Marcus and the Washington family had become an obsession that interfered with his ability to focus on client meetings and strategic planning. He made a decision that he would later recognize as a turning point in his personal and professional development. Harrison instructed his assistant to conduct discreet research on Robert Washington and his family, ostensibly for business intelligence purposes, but really to satisfy his own need to understand the people who had entered his daughter's life. The information that came back surprised him and challenged many of his assumptions about the Washington family's motivations and background. Robert Washington was indeed a prominent civil rights attorney, but his practice also included a substantial amount of corporate law work for minority-owned businesses and professional development organizations. He had a reputation for principled advocacy that had earned respect even from attorneys who had opposed him in litigation. Several of Harrison's business associates had actually recommended Washington for complex legal matters unrelated to discrimination issues. Marcus's academic record at Northfield Academy was exemplary. He was ranked third in his class, served as captain of the debate team, and had already received early admission offers from Harvard, Yale, and Stanford universities. His extracurricular activities included volunteer work at community centers and participation in academic competitions that had brought recognition to Northfield Academy. The Washington family's social and professional networks included university professors, federal judges, medical researchers, and business leaders who constituted an impressive cross-section of Chicago's intellectual and professional elite. Their involvement in community organizations and charitable activities demonstrated a commitment to social justice that was grounded in substantial personal success and professional achievement. Harrison realized that his assumptions about the Washington family had been colored by his defensive reactions to the lawsuit rather than by objective assessment of their character and achievements. The family represented exactly the kind of intellectual and professional excellence that Harrison claimed to value, but he had been unable to see it clearly because of his own prejudices and legal concerns. Chapter 12. The Confrontation with Truth. After reviewing the research about the Washington family, Harrison was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that his opposition to Emma's friendship with Marcus was rooted in his own unresolved guilt and defensive reactions, rather than in any legitimate concerns about the boy's character or family background. This realization created a crisis of conscience that challenged his fundamental assumptions about fairness, merit, and social responsibility. Harrison began to review his own business practices with the critical perspective that Robert Washington had brought to the lawsuit 3 years earlier. Without the pressure of legal proceedings and public scrutiny, he could now examine his firm's client development, hiring, and partnership decisions with greater honesty about their impact on diversity and inclusion. The patterns that Washington had identified were indeed present in Harrison's business operations, but Harrison began to understand that these patterns were not necessarily the result of conscious discrimination, but rather of unconscious biases and systemic advantages that he had never been required to examine. This understanding did not excuse the discriminatory impact, but it helped Harrison see possibilities for change and improvement. Harrison realized that Marcus's friendship with Emma represented an opportunity rather than a threat. The boy's intelligence, academic excellence, and family background exemplified the kind of merit-based achievement that Harrison claimed to respect. Marcus's perspectives on social justice issues could provide valuable insights that might help Harrison's firm develop more inclusive practices that would benefit both the business and the broader community. The most difficult realization for Harrison was acknowledging that his initial resistance to Marcus had been motivated by fear and prejudice rather than by rational business or parental concerns. He had projected his own guilt about the lawsuit onto an innocent teenager who had done nothing but excel academically and form a friendship with Harrison's daughter. Harrison understood that his response to this situation would define not only his relationship with Emma, but also his own character and values. He could continue to resist the friendship based on his own prejudices, or he could embrace the opportunity to learn from the Washington family's perspectives and experiences. Chapter 13: The Transformation. Harrison made a decision that required considerable courage and humility. He would reach out to Robert Washington directly to acknowledge their shared connection through their children's friendship and to address the unresolved issues from their previous legal conflict. This decision represented a fundamental shift in Harrison's approach to both business and personal relationships. The phone call to Robert Washington was one of the most difficult conversations of Harrison's professional life, but it proved to be transformative for both men. Harrison acknowledged that the lawsuit had forced him to examine business practices that had unintentionally contributed to systemic discrimination, and he expressed genuine appreciation for Washington's principled advocacy on behalf of his clients. Washington received Harrison's outreach with cautious but genuine interest, recognizing the courage required for a former legal adversary to initiate such a conversation. The attorney had been aware of Marcus's friendship with Emma, but had allowed his son to form his own relationships without prejudice based on their father's previous conflict. The conversation evolved into a broader discussion about social responsibility, business ethics, and the challenges of creating more inclusive opportunities in American business and society. Both men found common ground in their desires to provide their children with values and opportunities that would enable them to contribute positively to their communities. Harrison proposed a meeting that would include both families, acknowledging that their children's friendship had created an opportunity for the adults to move beyond their previous conflict toward mutual understanding and potential collaboration. Washington agreed, recognizing that such reconciliation could model positive conflict resolution for their children. The dinner meeting that followed was initially awkward but ultimately productive, with both families discovering shared values around education, achievement, and social responsibility despite their different perspectives on systemic inequality and historical injustice. Emma and Marcus were delighted to see their parents developing a respectful relationship that validated their own friendship. Harrison's business practices began to evolve as a result of insights gained from his relationship with the Washington family. He implemented diversity initiatives, modified client development strategies, and created partnerships with minority-owned businesses that enhanced both his firm's performance and its positive community impact. The friendship between Emma and Marcus continued to flourish, eventually developing into a romantic relationship that was supported by both families. Their academic collaboration on civil rights history had created a foundation for ongoing dialogue about social justice issues that influenced both families' perspectives on contemporary challenges. Harrison's transformation from defensive legal adversary to collaborative community partner became a model for how business leaders could address systemic inequality through changed practices rather than merely defensive posturing. His willingness to examine his own biases and modify his business operations demonstrated that meaningful change was possible when leaders accepted responsibility for their role in perpetuating discriminatory systems. Thank you for joining us on this powerful journey of recognition, reconciliation, and redemption. Harrison's story reminds us that our prejudices and assumptions can blind us to the very people who might become our greatest teachers and allies. Sometimes the encounters we resist most strongly are exactly the ones we need most to challenge our perspectives and help us grow into better versions of ourselves. We're grateful you took the time to experience this tale of transformation with us. Please share in the comments where you're listening from around the world. We love connecting with our global community and hearing how these stories of courage, change, and human dignity resonate with people from all walks of life.